Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at the outdoor garden railroad located on the museum grounds. Since its beginnings in the mid-1990s, this operating layout has grown to become one of the museum's most popular attractions. But when it was first being constructed, this was a pioneering project in the garden railway world, and the Colorado Railroad Museum was a much different place. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today has been a big part of the museum for well over 25 years, and it remains wildly popular with families and especially younger kids visiting the museum. Come join me now as we explore the history of the organization that built the layout and maintains it faithfully, the Denver Garden Railway Society. We'll also step back in time for a look at the construction of this monumental miniature railroad environment. Gardening and miniature railroading. Most homeowners probably don't consider the two as a natural combination, but they certainly can be. The hobby of garden railroading had its beginnings around the turn of the 20th century in Great Britain, but it wasn't quite what we might think. There, the term garden was pretty much the same as what we might call our yard, the outdoor area around a house. It didn't really matter whether there was any gardening involved. Most of the miniature trains that were used outdoors were of a gauge called 1, standardized as early as the 1880s by the German firm of Marklin. Even though it was the smallest of 3 standard model track gauges, gauge 1 was still pretty large, at least by today's standards. Few people had enough space indoors to build a railway, so they proceeded to build it outdoors instead. The more sophisticated builders shaped the terrain through which their trains ran and added suitable plantings to enhance the presentation. In the United States, however, miniature trains followed a completely different path. A completely different track gauge, called standard gauge, caught on, and manufacturer Lionel became its best-known manufacturer, followed by American Flyer. Most significantly, their trains were promoted for indoor use. Deploying them outdoors was hardly given thought by most of the adults and kids who spent time with them. Were these early model trains toys or scale models? This might be a good time for us to pause and discuss the differences. Toy trains were created with children in mind, and usually they were colorful and whimsical in their presentation. Scale models, on the other hand, were intended for use by grown-ups. They were exact copies of the originals, scaled down much more accurately to a miniature size. Today's garden railroads can and do have both kinds of trains, with one or the other typically being the focus, depending on the owner's tastes. What's the difference when we talk about scale versus when we discuss gauge in miniature railroading? Well, scale refers to the proportion of a model in respect to the original. It's sort of like the size of the model, if you will. Scale is typically expressed in a ratio, such as 1:48, which is called O scale here in the US. The scale known as HO, today the most popular railroad modeling scale, is roughly half the size of O scale at 1:87, and that's how it came to be called HO. Gauge, on the other hand, is the distance between the rails, the same term that we use in full-size railroading. Gauge tends to have a relationship to scale when it comes to miniatures, but this can vary wildly with model trains and toy trains for a number of reasons. Particularly in more toy-like miniature railroading, a single track gauge can serve as a guideway for trains of many different sizes or scales. Now, in scale modeling, a single scale or ratio can involve different gauges of track. If you stop to consider this for a moment, the same situation arises in full-size railroading. Think about narrow gauge versus standard gauge tracks and trains, for instance. Colorado's narrow gauge trains may themselves be smaller than their standard gauge counterparts, but are they the same scale? Well, they are both full size with a ratio of 1:1, so of course they are. There's one final overarching aspect of model railroading to consider: power and control. Consider this: model trains can be unpowered, meaning they require someone to push them, although today this is rare. They can be powered by a wind-up or clockwork mechanism, something that was once quite common. They can also be powered by electricity, which has become the most common means for model railroading. In large-scale model railroading, diesel or gasoline engines are also used. There's one final option. Miniature trains can be powered by actual live steam pressure, just like a steam locomotive. When it comes to control, track voltage can be how you get the train to move for electric trains, or you can use a form of remote control, such as radio control, or something these days called digital command control. Garden railroading fell out of favor in Britain and Europe over time, with world wars contributing to the decline. The rebirth of garden railroading began in the late 1960s, and once again in Europe. The German company of Ernst Paul Lehmann, toymakers from way back, in 1969 introduced all plastic models of narrow-gauge trains from Germany. They were built to a new scale of 1 to 22.5, and they ran on the old standardized gauge 1 track. These Lehmann Grossbahn, or LGB models, which stands for Big Train, were specifically designed for use outdoors. Their rugged construction encapsulated gears and motors to keep things functioning in an outdoor environment. Since the trains were brightly colored models of European equipment, they were looked upon as toys by most serious modelers in the US and the United Kingdom. Over time, the company created new products based on railroads from around the world. Eventually, articles on these trains in outdoor environments began to appear in model train magazines. These trains became known as G-gauge, short for garden. By the mid-1970s, the flame was kindled for the rebirth of garden railroading in the US. Today, there are several large American companies making trains for use in the garden, following LGB's basic concepts. To complement these manufacturers, dozens of small companies and cottage industries are putting out related products. Interestingly, Denver has played an outsized role in helping this rebirth take shape. The Denver Garden Railway Society, or for short DGRS, was the first organization of its kind in the US. It was founded in 1979, while the garden railroading hobby was still young. Not many G-scale model trains were available, especially of American appearance, and relatively few people were interested in model railroading outdoors. The society soon had a dozen or so members, and it quickly grew too large to meet in living rooms, so it branched out. DGRS began setting up temporary tracks at shopping malls for special events, which attracted more members, and the group began looking for public places to hold meetings, including a brief stint at Denver's Union Station. In 1984, one of the Society's founders, Mark Horovitz, started Garden Railways magazine along with his wife Barbara. While covering the entire field of garden railroading, the publication stressed the importance of integrating the railway with a garden to achieve a railway-like atmosphere. It was the only model train magazine with regular gardening articles, plus its own horticultural editor. Just 1 year later, the new magazine's publisher suggested that Garden Railways and DGRS co-sponsor a National Garden Railway Convention. This would incorporate an annual steam-up and a backyard railway tour that had begun several years earlier, promoted by a local sign company. The first annual Garden Railway Convention was held in August 1985 in Denver. Organized by a half-dozen DGRS members, the convention was a great success. It was structured from the beginning with a steam-up, railway tours, clinics, and an exhibit hall. The convention was hosted 3 additional years in Denver, getting bigger and better each time. It attracted visitors from all around the US and many foreign countries. When the 5th one came around, the club set it free to travel around the US, something that has continued up to the present. The club continued to grow and become a solid, cohesive community of friends pursuing a common interest. In 1994, the Garden Railway Convention returned to Denver for its 10th annual gathering. In September of that same year, the Colorado Railroad Museum agreed to allow DGRS to build a garden railway as a permanent display. Starting out as one simple track loop, it has expanded several times to its present size. The location offered by the Colorado Railroad Museum and chosen for a future garden railroad was initially viewed as a mixed bag of potential. Located below the north fill of the museum's narrow gauge operating loop, the unused plot of land was covered with tall weeds, brush, and poison ivy. The land sloped steeply down from 2 sides to form a small, shallow pond created by natural drainage and seepage from a nearby irrigation canal. Although some DGRS members saw the area as a poor choice, there were also tall cottonwood trees for shade. The famed dome car monument from Glenwood Canyon had been moved nearby in 1985 as well. Plus, water and electricity were available just a couple hundred feet away in the museum's original depot structure. And the time was right for many reasons, not the least of which was that the museum itself was beginning a major transformation. Less than a year earlier, in fall 1993, the Colorado Railroad Museum had mailed out a letter to all museum members, announcing the start of an ambitious fundraising program. A new library to house the museum's extensive archives, plus a building in which to perform rail vehicle restoration and maintenance, were both planned. For good measure, the goal would include extending the museum's operating trackage to form a complete loop. The birth of a new garden railroad would thus help contribute to a reinvigorated Colorado Railroad Museum. To demonstrate what was to come, DGRS members started with a simple 10-foot diameter loop around one of the cottonwood trees. Trains were run on this loop using battery power as society members took measurements, cleared the ground of weeds and brush, and hauled in tons of fill and rock that would be necessary to create track loop terraces and walkways. As the terraces took shape, they helped form a deeper stream and pond that could now serve as a water feature. Remember, this is a garden railroad. In these early years, a farmhouse stood on the site of what is today the Robert W. Richardson Library. A very tired motel stood on the site of today's Cornelius W. Houck Roundhouse facility, and the museum's operating trackage consisted of a half-moon rather than a complete loop. As they worked to construct the new garden railroad, DGRS members would watch the transformations going on all around them. In May 1996, the museum broke ground for its new Robert W. Richardson Library. The former Iron Horse Motel was acquired and fully closed down that July, then demolished the following year. In the interim, construction of the library had been completed, along with a good deal of work on the Denver Garden Railway Society's layout. As the Garden Railroad continued to progress, backhoes were brought in to dig a utility trench, plus help shape the deepest portions of the stream and pond areas. By 1998, the site had progressed remarkably, and a big picnic was held by DGRS. Later that fall, construction of the Garden Railroad's signature Alpine Tunnel station got underway, based on a scaled-down version of the prototype that once graced the portal of the famed South Park Line's Alpine Tunnel right here in Colorado. It would be completed by spring 1999, along with more improvements to the layout. On Saturday, June 26, 1999, a big day arrived for the Garden Railroad layout. Formal dedication ceremonies were held that morning, followed by another big picnic to honor the hard-working members who had brought the layout to fruition. Crowds were on hand to watch as the layout began to fulfill its potential. Just a few weeks later, another celebration would be held, this time to commemorate completion of the museum's operating railroad loop. Ground would be broken for the museum roundhouse shortly after both of these big milestones, making 1999 a year of great accomplishment all around. A separate elevated section of the layout was added shortly after, featuring 2 unpowered track loops for live steam operations. The layout was again enlarged a few years later when the fence line was expanded so 2 outer loop tracks could be added, along with a switching yard and a small rose garden railway loop. To provide safe passage over one arm of the stream feeding into the layout, a double-track steel bridge carrying 2 tracks plus a walkway for D&RG crews was fabricated and carefully moved into place in 2006. With this addition, the layout took on its present form, featuring a total of 7 track-powered operating loops, plus the live steam elevated section. Since that time, the live steam loop has been rebuilt with yet another loop added, featuring dual-gauge track. Given the nature of live steam operations, 2 special steam-up bays or track sidings are available, so operators can build up steam on their locomotives even while others are operating on the track loops. Today, the Denver Garden Railway Society layout at the Colorado Railroad Museum is a special attraction whenever trains are operating. And even if it's a day when nobody has made it out to run trains, the railroad still fascinates guests with its scaled-down railroad in a garden appearance. The operating day usually begins with cleaning of tracks. Wooden poles with drywall sanding pads are most commonly used, pushed by hand, with a locomotive modified by the addition of a small car with rotating brush, sometimes being used to continue cleaning throughout the day. If a major rain or snow has fallen since the last operations, a walk-around is typically conducted to ensure that no debris is present that could have damaged a bridge or blocked a tunnel or that might be struck by passing trains. On the track-powered portion of the layout, trains are typically operated using a simple radio control system. More recently, 2 tracks have been modified to work with DCC, which is short for Digital Command Control. With this system, the operator has greater control, and audible sounds coming from the operating trains sync up directly as each train starts up, accelerates, brakes, and whistles for grade crossings. The many buildings and structures on the layout have all been scratch-built or kit-bashed by D&RG members, while the bridges, both wood and metal, were all scratch-built. There are small houses and mansions, water and coaling towers, stations, an oil well derrick, gas station, and many more structures that give this railway a reason to exist. Then there are the plants and trees, which include juniper and spruce, barberry and boxwood, sedum and herbaceous varieties, and water plants. There are even varieties of flowering plants for color, meaning that the plants are not always strictly to scale. The addition of sprinkler systems over the years has allowed the landscape to expand along with the railroad layout itself. Weather is a very real concern for any garden railroad in the Denver region, and especially in Golden, which is right up against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. For starters, plants must be able to survive major variations in temperature and precipitation, along with critters that share the space, including rabbits, foxes and coyotes, deer, and others. Because of the strong ultraviolet radiation at mile-high elevations, paints and stains fade quickly and plastics become brittle. Crazy temperature variations along with occasional 100+ miles per hour winds mean that maintenance is constant and ongoing. Over the years, the relationship between D&RG and the museum has grown into a partnership. A substantial proportion of Society members are also museum volunteers, supporting special events, working on track maintenance, or in train operations, volunteering in the library, and working on rail vehicle maintenance and restoration. The constant flow of museum visitors includes school groups, senior tours, civic gatherings in the museum's covered picnic pavilion, plus the many regional families and tourists who visit year-round. DGRS members operate trains on the layout while interacting with visitors, answering their many questions, including, are those real trees? What do you do with the track in the winter? And of course, how much does it cost to build a garden railroad? But the Denver Garden Railway Society's layout comes alive for the biggest numbers of guests during long summer weekends and some of the museum's signature special events. Of these, Day Out with Thomas and other kid-themed events such as Dinosaur Express Train and the Harvest Haunt Express bring out the biggest crowds. Often, younger children will follow a train all the way around the outer track loop. It's easy for them to get distracted along the way, however, especially if Thomas the Tank Engine or one of his friends happens along on another track. During Day Out with Thomas events, the full-size Thomas might even pass by. In 2022, the Denver Garden Railway Society is once again involved in hosting yet another Garden Railway Convention. This continues a long and pioneering tradition of garden railroading in the Denver metro region, with workshops, backyard layout tours, and a vendors expo all being planned. The Colorado Railroad Museum is proud of the many accomplishments of the Society and is looking forward to the partnership continuing for benefit of model railroaders as well as museum guests well into the future. Thanks for joining me today. The Colorado Railroad Museum today is known for housing Colorado's most comprehensive collection of railroad locomotives and cars. As the museum has grown and prospered, however, it has also become known not just for its full-size trains, but also for so much more. The massive HO layout that is operated by the Denver HO Model Railroad Club is one example, while the Garden Railroad, operated by the Denver Garden Railway Society, is yet another. Rounding out these attractions are changing exhibits, seasonal interpretive programs, and signature events throughout the year. I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of the Denver Garden Railway Society's layout at the museum and the stories behind its construction, ongoing maintenance, and frequent operation. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collection.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.